Was this? Did you try the mic? Is it high enough for you? Because you can adjust it.
Thank you.
Okay. All right. I'm going to start. Okay. Hi everyone. Thanks for coming. I'd like to get tonight started by introducing Bassam El Baroni, our speaker tonight. I'm Lee Markopoulos, the chair of the Curatorial Practice MA program here at CCA, and Bassam is visiting to teach on our program and also to give this lecture. He has traveled here from Alexandria in Egypt, where he's the co-founder and director of the Alexandria Contemporary Arts Forum, ACAF, a collectively run non-profit multidisciplinary arts initiative which has been in operation since December 2005. You may have heard of them through their participation in the curation of last year's Manifesta 8 in Murcia in Spain, which they collaboratively curated together with the Chamber of Public Secrets and Transit.org. Bassam's recent curatorial projects include Alexandria's first international media art festival, Cleotronica, 8 in 2008, an exhibition called Trapped in Amber, Angst for a Re-Enacted Decade, which drew on Oslo's art history and was co-curated with Helga-Marie Nordby at UKS in Oslo, and AKA Education, or Art Known as Education, an extended program which took place in Alexandria a couple of years ago and presented ideas and discussions around the growing tendency to incorporate and highlight the educational within contemporary artistic and curatorial practices. He's just told me that he's currently working on a group show and publication entitled 15 Ways to Leave Badiou, in which artists have been invited to respond to Badiou's 15 theses on contemporary art. And tonight he's presenting a version of a lecture he recently gave in Zagreb, Croatia, entitled Just What Is It That Makes Today's Transnationalism So Prescribed, So Paradoxical? So please join me in welcoming Bassam El Baroni.
Thank you, Lee. I'd like to start by thanking the CCA for inviting me here. What the talk is about, I think, is this kind of elephant in the room that I think is always present when we talk about contemporary art, which is that other art, that people call it bad art. There are many different ways to, although there is bad contemporary art, but I mean, many different ways to talk about it, like this kind of stuff. And I'm going to horrify you with a stream of really horrible pictures. It just gets worse and worse. You just love it. What I really want to talk about is what's really behind this idea of what I term fine art. And I know that many interesting art schools are still called fine art academies, but I prefer the term fine art. Personally, I studied at the Academy of Fine Art in Alexandria, and where we were, basically taught to do this kind of stuff. And over my kind of experience, through international, being integrated into the national circuit of contemporary art, while still being embedded in local practice, I often try to analyze the reason between this division and why it's important not to just throw these kinds of practices into the rubbish bin of history, but to understand why they still exist. And I think understanding why they still exist is key, because in reality, they're actually much more popular than contemporary art, even if we'd like to believe that contemporary art is, the king. But it's the truth that wherever you go in the world, developed nations or so-called developing nations, fine art is the predominant form that people understand. Now, while I continue these horrific images, I can start reading from my text here. So my talk today will have a number of interconnected themes or axes. Some of the questions I will be attempting to engage with are fine art versus contemporary art, what is really behind the division, and multiculturalism as universality, and where do we go from here? So these are the two axes, and as the talk progresses, hopefully the link will emerge between these two axes of fine art and contemporary art, and multiculturalism and universality, which I think these two axes, when they converge, they create, like the kind of thesis that I reach as the climax. After and sometimes during the span of a transnational art event, such as a biennial, journalistic and critical material circulates pointing towards the event's over or underrepresentation of artists from a certain region, the nationalities of the participating artists, etc. In these debates, the wider issues of what kind of art is subject to exclusion in present-day so-called transnationalism or transculturalism, and the reasons behind this supposed ineligibility, are often overlooked. The majority of art being produced around the world is non-compatible with the paradigm of contemporary discursive art production that the curators of such events aspire to. In fact, it might not be a matter of aspiration, but actually of obligation. Most people's imaginary of what art is can be tagged under the term fine art, art characterized by the academic application and or manipulation of canonical art histories. The present-day biennial and similar event structures favor contemporary art over fine art, and the reasons given are unconvincing for most people. It is an unraveling, analyzing, and healing the schism between these two nodes of art that might lay a more pertinent chance for a radical transcultural model unlike the one in place today. The spectrum of issues related to these ideas are for me related to one question. Has universality not left a hole that needs to be filled? Or does its ties with colonialism and notions of Western intellectual supremacy make it too touchy an issue to readdress? Can we stop deconstructing universality and start thinking about it on positive terms? Is not universality, simply put, a good word with bad connotations that cannot be redeemed by the intellectual left? Multiculturalism, universality's supposed heir, is a mere branch of a much larger schema that is not just about inclusion and representation, but more importantly about the displacement of severely tangled class, gender, historical, and political threads into the ambiguous category of culture. And it is this apparatus or schema that I will be referring to in my talk today. Briefly, how do we define fine art? In general, it's characterized by the very traditional academic application and manipulation of canonical art histories and art schools. While some fine art is interesting, the overwhelmingly large majority of it is usually defined as weird, commercial, or kitsch by contemporary art. Thus, it is a rare occurrence to see a work of fine art in a contemporary art exhibition. And if one makes its way into such an exhibition, it is always justified under some curatorial state of exception. But the question here is why fine art is seen as an oddity by the so-called contemporary. I think a closer look at The premises on which different universalities are based is key to understanding this. While contemporary art has successfully adopted the paradoxical universalism of multiculturalism, and later I'll talk about why it's paradoxical, fine art has not. Fine art is stuck somewhere in between the universalism of Picasso's Guernica and the universality of multiculturalism, not able to fully empower itself with either. It has become somewhat of a partial object for contemporary art, dead, yet very much alive. Okay, so let me get to the core of the discussion. This is some kind of quirky little diagram I made that I hope will help explain what I'm talking about. So, if you can see the circle to your left, this is the construct of basically what universalism meant for the artist in the period in what I call from up until around the mid-1980s. It's a universalism that actually started with the Enlightenment, the French Enlightenment. The values and the ethics of the Enlightenment, which kind of were built on the idea of the individuality of artistic expression. And of course, you know, with that comes a bundle of certain ethics. So, at the very core of this universality, which I call old school European universalism, there's the Enlightenment, which is embedded inside the individual, and then the individual kind of shines his or her individuality to the world. And that's basically the source of the universality. What is the state of this universality today? I mean, in terms of how art functions. I think this today is a non-functional model for universality. It doesn't work. It's also a ghost universalism, meaning that it exists. Even though it doesn't work, it's not accepted as the universality that is functional. It still exists as a kind of, what do you call it? Like, you know, in film, when you have the ghost of a film. I mean, it's still, I mean, like one student in a certain fine art academy in Philadelphia, for example, conservative fine art academy, can share the exact same idea of what an artist is as somebody studying in the fine art academy in Alexandria. So it's the kind of negative of contemporary art in a way. One of the positive things that it perhaps is more you know, the more positive attributes of it is that it registers in this kind of idea of the life world. You know, there's the certain idea developed by Husserl and Habermas, where there's a moment, there's a kind of world, or a moment in the world before analyzing and before philosophizing something and critiquing it. This is what they call the life world, the moment pre that. And in a way, it registers in that kind of world much better than contemporary art. I mean, like for most people, the majority of people on the street, they would connect much more to fine art than contemporary art. And I think this is unmistakably a general phenomenon in most parts of the world. Now, funnily enough, as I will try and prove later, most of the art produced up until the 80s still used old school European universalism as the backbone of the universality. And if I can make a claim that art without some sort of universality is almost impossible, then there must be some sort of universality at play in art production. Contemporary art, however, is the minority of art since the 80s, but it's more celebrated. And it's based on the idea of multiculturalist universalism. Now, the difference between multiculturalist universalism and or multiculturalist universality and old school European universalism is that actually it works top down. You actually, as an artist, you don't really have to think about it. It's already done for you, in a way, because it's a bureaucratical, ethical, aesthetic system. It's based on the idea of embedding universality through bureaucracy, through the idea of multiculturalism, criteria, certain protocols, in the wording of presenting art that actually take the burden off the artist most of the time in actually having to think about whether their work functions universally or not. But at the same time, a lot of these protocols, in a way, have to be abided by in order for an artwork to succeed. In order for it to succeed, they have to abide by the bureaucratical, ethical, aesthetic system that multiculturalist universality has created. At the core of this new system, of this multiculturalist universalism, are things such as identity, culture, particularity, and pluralism. The status of it today is that it's the functional universalism, but it's also the paradoxical universalism, and it mostly fails to register in the life world. If I try and describe what I mean by a bureaucratical, ethical, aesthetic system, I can talk about the ethical part first, and I can say that it's contrary to the popular belief, believed even within art circles. The current schema controlling the arts is excessively ethical rather than lacking in ethical standards. It is precisely through invisible governance with overloaded ethics that often have the same DNA as that of the old school European universalism that the system is able to maintain its appearance of democracy and openness. And perhaps this is what Louis Kamnitsa, the well-known Uruguayan artist and thinker, was getting at when he wrote this in 1989. And he says, by placing the ethical commitment solely on content, we may feel better, but fail to address the issue. We merely confirm the disassociation and hope to solve two different problems, that of content and form he's talking about. Two different problems with one and the same solution, by relying on taste and inspiration to define the aesthetics of packaging that content we place. The responsibility for whatever happens on an unconscious and unchallenged ideological platform because of our intention. This ideological platform, more often than not, escapes our control. We thus let decisions be made for us instead of bias. And I think this is what he's getting at, the idea that the decisions are made made for us in terms of how we have to deal, or we should deal with the issue of universality. Because the the previous form of universality is deemed as a kind of taboo. You know, it's really linked to, it's being kind of tagged with this idea of, you know, the black mark of colonialism and so on and so on. But it's almost as if the system doesn't allow us to imagine a universality that is not already made for us. It's not, you know, packaged through bureaucracy, through, you know, applications, through the idea of the project and so on and so on. And so we have to comply to certain standards, certain universal standards. Anyway, let me continue. Just so I don't get too philosophical and abstract, I want to go back to this idea of the difference between old school European universalism and multiculturalist universalism, and to try and give examples, not from art that is actually made today, but how this kind of evolved. And one example I can make is, for example, an artist like Paul Klee. And Paul Klee, Swiss artist who, you know, one of the pillars of modernism, who went to Tunisia, this very famous trip, well-known trip, you know, many art historians have written about it. And in Tunisia, in the 20s, he made these, you know, beautiful watercolors and paintings. He got influenced by, you know, the quality of light, the quality of architecture, so on and so on. And, you know, this is how he dealt with it. And this is the artist as the individual. He himself goes there, gets inspired by something new. His inspiration is shown to the world as this universality. And obviously we look at the work and we can all relate to it, I think. Now, if we do a kind of fast forward and we see another artist, I can just read this out. So, consider the difference between how Paul Klee responded to artistically to a stay in Tunisia, and between how Allegero Boetti created his map series by working with artisans from Afghanistan. Klee represents the artist who starts spreading his individuality as the universal, while this 1978 piece by Boetti signals an unconscious understanding of how art was going to be shaped across or along geopolitical and cultural lines for decades to come. It's also the beginning of the universality of multiculturalism. This, I think, is one of the main engines behind the collective unconscious of the contemporary art industry. You know, I think this is, you know, I think Boetti was very intelligent in kind of picking up this idea, you know, and it's, of course, it all starts with conceptual practice, you know, the roots of contemporary art. Or what we define as contemporary art today. But I mean, this idea that actually other people are making my work, and they're, you know, Afghani artisans. So the whole equation of how this work is produced is it resembles a lot how a lot of, you know, conceptual ideas are, you know, they evolve in contemporary art today, and how this logic of multiculturalism is perceived, where this universality is here in the work. It's the idea that the artist himself, makes the work plural, and this idea of making it plural is, I think, an early precursor to the necessity for that, in a way, in contemporary practice. But when I talk about how old school universality worked, I should elaborate, because you know, everything is connected here. And so, how old school universality worked. The artistic canon of modernism managed to use its individuality as the medium of the universal, while considering the particulars of time, place, ethnicity, gender, and so on, to be of a secondary nature. These particularities and what they were part of were in a way almost invisible to the canon. So, for example, Picasso could reference African sculpture as form, as spiritual significance, and so on, but whatever he did with it, it was not really referencing or commenting on Africa or the idea of Africanness, simply because Africa was somehow invisible to his individual self. The creator of universality. This strangely explains why the ways of the canon could actually become popular all over the world without there being clear forms of resistance towards their aesthetics or their ethics. Simply because at the core of the work, there was predominantly the individual and the ethics of individuality. An artist from Africa or Asia could switch the equation around, with Europe being invisible to him or herself, and his or her individuality being the nucleus from which the universality emerges. As long as the source of universality was an individual with all his specifics of individuality and was not a heavy-handed cultural entity or particularity outside of the artistic self, it was not an issue to reappropriate, develop, and build on the mannerisms, techniques, and ideas of the canon. But look at the universality of today. It asserts that its core is outside the individual and invites what it perceives as identities, cultures, and particularities to formulate a plural universality. The problem is that it has to first define them as identities, cultures, and particularities in order to allow them to form its core. Thus, the equation cannot be turned around any longer, and full control is achieved. So that's the difference between the two universalities in a way. But that still doesn't get to the question of why fine art is really more popular and more ever present than contemporary art. And I think to look at that, one has to go to pedagogical reasons in a way. And of course, pedagogical reasons are they're very rooted in also in understandings of universality. Regarding the overall predisposition of fine art today and what keeps it alive, perhaps there is no single exact reason for its continuity and its characteristics, but we can try to pinpoint a set of conditions that give it its momentum and crystallize its formulas, an equation that generates its continuity. In the Egyptian context, for example, an example I am sure that is repeated all around the world, we need to look no further than the practices of the fine art academies or schools of fine art, where art history is the first layer or the informational grounding for the artificial resuscitation of fine art. Art history is delivered as a clear-cut story that links non-critical narratives of socio-political history to artistic practice, step by step, in a deterministic formula. The idea is that the artist's methodologies and subject matters were a logical result of their political and social environments, and that changes or shifts only occur as a direct result of changes or shifts in these environments. The implications of this mode of delivering art history are huge. It leads to a kind of fossilization of art through narrative. The idea of the end of art begins here. The end of art, which means in fine art practice and in fine art pedagogical discourse, it means that contemporary art is not art, basically. which is, essential characteristic of teaching art history in such schools. We are somehow led into an artificial time zone where we feel and act as if art's great achievements have been already inscribed as something permanent, and that now we exist in an era that can be described as an infinite transmission that starts after the end of this historical narrative, putting a freeze on any attempt to step outside this zone. This artificial zone is cut off from the present and the future as much as it possibly can. Thus, the only valid artwork in this zone is one that has a direct and simple predecessor in art history, from, say, ancient Egyptian to pop art. The artist must use indicators, symbols, signs, devices that strongly connect him or her to the lineage of this art history. Otherwise, it will not be recognized as art. So, the crucial difference between fine art and what has been labeled as contemporary art is how art history is perceived. And this is where I use some terminology that might be a little bit awkward, but it's an attempt to try and describe what, through my personal experience with students in different parts of the world who kind of study under the fine art mode, and perhaps who want to be recognized, become internationally recognized artists. So I always try to get to the root of the problem. Now, art history is key to understanding the difference, of course. Fine art views art history, but also social and political history, as a scriptic catalog. I'll tell you what that means later. It's artists as characters in the theater of aesthetic modernity. And the fine artist's work starting point is the imagined necessity of inserting his or her work in the encyclopedia of artistic identities and characters. So, what do I mean by this? I mean that actually, if you are a fine artist, you have to define your identity from a selection, a pre-selected kind of catalog of artistic identities. So, for example, and you have to do this before your work. So, for example, you define yourself as, for example, the romantic tortured soul. I mean, this is probably a character that we all can recognize from some, bad art that we've probably seen somewhere. And so I'm the romantic tortured soul. This is my position. This is my identity. I flick through this scriptic catalog of art history, and voila, I see my my soulmate. There are lots of artists who have this kind of tendency, but of course, the work in the scriptic catalog actually of art history was somehow universal, because the type of universality that they used was functional back then, but now it's not functional anymore. But still, I'm a fine artist, and I can't relate to the universality that's working today, which I call multiculturalist universality. So I'll just choose my character anyway, or I'll blend a couple of these characters and create my own, kind of cocktail. And I'll do that before I start working, and my work will be an emblem, a flag for that personality. Basically, that's how I see the production of fine art. And this is why I use the term theater of aesthetic modernity, because also when the theater aspect is that there is an element of role playing here. And I think it's essential when you talk to people who still kind of adhere to the notion of fine art. And there's also the idea of aesthetic modernity there. And there's the ultimate goal of the fine artist is that actually in this scripted catalog, one day they will be featured. So, I mean, it's not necessarily they as people, but their character, or that they've blended from a different set of characters in this, grand theater of art history, will one day be mentioned. They will be the contemporary El Greco, for example, or something. Now, I think this opens up a different not characterization, but it opens a different type of classification, if you know what I mean. For fine art, art history is a catalog or some sort of script, or perhaps a scripted catalog of artists' characters, methods, styles, symbols, and social political indicators. For contemporary art, history is seen as yet another archive. Archive here is the second. So I have two classifications. Some artists adhere to the scripted catalog and others adhere to the archive. But I'll explain that a bit later. Yet it's for contemporary art, history is seen as yet another archive of images, facts, subjectivities, social and political agendas and notions. During postmodernism, and at least until around the first half of the 80s, most art in Europe and the United States was being produced in continuum with this notion of a scripted catalog of art history. Consciously or unconsciously, artists had to somehow insert themselves into the script called linear artistry. So if we take, for example, artists such as Beuys, Jan Adder, Burden, Kiefer, the Transavanguardia Italiana, and others, we can correlate their work to the idea of the scripted catalog of art history. This might be surprising for some, but I'll try and prove it. Or what can be referred to as the theater of aesthetic modernity or the stage of aesthetic modernity. Through the artistic persona they embody in their works, they managed to do this. They embodied the romantic, the utopian, the expressionist, the Redimier, the mannerist, the science-based loony artist. So an image trail to give you an example of this continuity well into the 80s and beyond. By taking just one of these characters, for example, the idea of the body defying its natural limits. A character, the death-defying, I don't know, we can call this character anything, but it's like Evel Knievel, something, like the death-defying soul or spirit who manages to defy pain and agony and death. So, I mean, what I want to prove by this image trail is actually, in this image trail, I have fine works of fine art produced recently by artists from different parts of the world, but also more well-known artists, even conceptual ones. But they were all, the more conceptual practices were all before the 80s. Death and the body defying its natural limits, taking on extreme thresholds of pain, is a popular reference in fine art practice, brought in from the scripted catalog of art history. Of course, this strain goes all the way back to portrayals of the crucifixion in ancient art, but in more recent times, one can trace its significance back to Van Gogh's self-portrait with a cut-off ear, through to some of the performance art of the 60s. In this image trail, we see how this persona takes varying forms from modernism to present-day fine art. An example being the Stuckists, who believe, Stuckists are a group of artists based in the UK originally, but now it's kind of like an international bad art movement in a way, who believe that most contemporary art, although they call it conceptual art, is dead while their art is alive. Most contemporary artists and curators would think that Stuckism is something along the lines of naive art. The division is really more about how one perceives art history, either as a catalogue of artistic characters and personas one has to insert oneself into, or as an archive that can be used to produce knowledge, positions, and criticisms. An extreme break with art history never occurred. But what changed later was precisely this idea of how an artist perceives art history, as well as social and political history. When more artists started perceiving it, not as a linear scriptic catalogue, but as a non-linear extensive archive where almost no materials in this archive had the quality of being semi-sacred, and where these materials or infos could be renegotiated, faked, deconstructed, the category of contemporary art really came into place. So, contemporary art views history as an open-ended archive. It claims it produces knowledge. Sometimes it confuses information for knowledge. Contemporary artist sees no necessity in inserting him or herself into the catalogue of artistic personas and characters. It deals with the question of how not to be formalist romantic, which is this idea from Badiou that contemporary art is about this question. It's the question of how do we not make art into basically the production of new forms that represent the same as existential kind of ideas that were presented in art in the last 5 centuries. You know, like death, sex, the body, you know, the major kind of is existential problematics. The universality of the archive is the universality at work, and it's not the universality of the artist at work. And I think this is the next image trail. I'll try and describe this. And this, of course, has to do with the division of universalities. So the shift, like I mentioned, I think started in the mid 80s, or just before that a little bit. It was always happening. It was a shift in continuum. But I think the moment when we can say contemporary, this is the era of contemporary art. I define it as probably something around 85, maybe a little bit earlier. And perhaps Weiner here is a good example to start declaring that this era has arrived and it's here for good for the meantime. Unlike previous conceptual practices, in this series of works by Lawrence Weiner, one finds it very difficult to pinpoint the artist's character. So unlike we saw in like the image trail before, where we saw works by Günter Bruce, the Austrian artist, or Burden, where they clearly had defined characters from the catalog of scriptic catalog of artistic identities and personas. We can't define one here for Weiner, for example. And not only that, it was enough for him just to write a sentence so we could imagine the artwork. And that means that we, as people in a kind of community or a larger community, have access to a shared archive. We don't need to actually see a form as in a form, solid form. We just can read the artwork and we can imagine. So when we read fire and brimstone in a hollow formed by hand, we know this is it's a sculpture, a conceptual sculpture. In the series of works by Lawrence Weiner, one finds it very difficult to pinpoint the artist's character within the scripted catalogue of artist personas. This is a noticeable shift evident in these works. They tell us that art has made the complete transition from the perception of its history as a scripted catalogue to the perception of it being an archive of ideas, images, macro histories, and identities. This shift signals a new equation of balance between subjectivity and objectivity. But I don't want just to limit it to like American conceptualism. Why not look at the work by a contemporary Egyptian artist, Hassan Khan? And this work is called Rant. And unfortunately, I couldn't get the video to show you. But it's a video piece, and basically what it's concerned with is the idea of an art scene in a place kind of off-center within the multiculturalist economy of contemporary art. There are many of these, cities around the world, where they have a kind of a place, like a city where it has a thriving but small art scene. It doesn't really have an artistic economy of its own. It depends completely on the cultural and artistic economies of other countries to support the artists there. So, for example, the Egyptian artist, Egyptian contemporary artist, is waiting for the chance of being in a biennial, for example, for him or her to produce a new work. Or, if they have a gallery, then they're lucky. But the galleries don't exist in Egypt. Also, they exist. So they're fully dependent. This, of course, creates a climate of extreme tension. Chances are little. Everybody is waiting for that kind of chance. And this was a situation that existed in Egypt probably up until 2005. A bit later, things got better because there are a number of pan-Arab foundations that opened and decided to support artists and so on. But around that time, things were pretty complex in terms of how to survive as an artist and survive in terms of producing artwork. So this video was inspired by that in a way. But at the same time, it's a universal video. There's nothing distinctively Egyptian about it. And I think anybody can relate to this actress who is probably portrayed as an artist, although the word artist is never mentioned, actually. It's just simply a young lady sitting in this white room saying things like this. The power of this video comes from the fact that we can relate to the emotions of the actress. We can relate to the textual material in the video, yet we cannot identify a clear model of the artist's character. There's no idea of individuality here. There's no role-playing here. The artist's character that we can recognize from the catalogue of art history. The artist is not creating something within himself and sending it out to the world as his universality, but through visual and textual signals, tapping into the shared pool of experience. This is what's called the archive. The whole idea of knowledge production, the pretext for most of the current discursive art industry, particularly its institutions, curators, and financing systems, be it subjective, objective, or a marriage of both, starts from the moment the artist perceives art history as an archive, the moment of the contemporary. At the other end of the spectrum, a fine art graduate trained to perceive art production as a catalogued linear script may be interested in contemporary production, but to actually produce a work that can be seen as contemporary, they must make the shift from wanting to insert themselves in that catalogue to a recognition of the archive. This explains why we get works that are half and half, what I will later term fine contemporary art. For example, a video portrait of the artist with Islamic calligraphy and colored geometric ornamentation making visual patterns over his or her face, while gunshots and cello music can both be heard in the soundtrack. Here, the artist still perceives of art history and general history as a catalogue. He or she is looking to insert their work in this encyclopedia of artistic identities and characters. And the work actually starts from this place of artistic identities and characters, although it uses up-to-date mediums and feels contemporary. Your individuality as an artist in fine art is prized highly, but at the same time, its source can only be the catalogue. So in the end, it's a question of what you can come up with by diluting and mixing prefab identities and icons. If, on the other hand, you conceive of art and life as an archive, you are not necessarily bound to such a fatalistic route. Although the power of the market and its institutions constantly push to stabilize their identities and equations, push the artists to stabilize their identities and equations. So if the category of contemporary art today is going through what can be called a routine phase, because of the repetition of once radical gestures and equations that have lost most of their agency and currency, the category of fine art is a form of hyper-routine, functioning in an agency-free zone, what I called the infinite intermission earlier. It is not meant to produce knowledge, but to reincarnate previous knowledge, all through the necessity of perceiving art history as a catalogue. In my view, this might be one of the main reasons why fine art still exists. But if the whole mechanism is revealed and artists lose their ability to relate to the catalogue and start thinking in terms of the archive, usually a gradual transition into the contemporary can be made. Universality in fine art is linked to the catalogue, particularly to those pages in the catalogue that appear under modernism, and the artist's persona or the artistic self as the center from which the universal emerges. Universality in contemporary art is linked directly or indirectly to the premise of knowledge production. The archive, the grand global culture of many cultures, the global economy, and so on. And in the end, one can replace universality in contemporary art with another more pragmatic term, multiculturalism. The difference, and this is the main argument, the difference between the universality of modernism and the universality of multiculturalism, the dominant universality today, then becomes the indicator for how compatible an artwork or an artist's practice is within the contemporary market. So, since all this lecture started, I started developing it through my experience with students in Egypt, in Ethiopia, in South Africa, in Armenia, and their kind of views on fine art and their relation to it as people who were studying it. I want to kind of plan this. I made this kind of plan of the options available to a hypothetical fine art student who who's not studying in a so-called progressive academy, an academy that is more towards, geared more towards fine art and classical standards of fine art education. So basically, they have 3 routes, I call them, that they can take. So this fine art, this hypothetical fine art student can choose between route number 1, which is fine art. The market status of fine art is that it's sellable in some local circles and sometimes through international auction houses. And it seems inferior, it's seen as inferior by the 3 other routes. The first route he or she can select is to be a fine artist. Since this route's universality is dysfunctional, what it can generate is dead art, i.e. art void of any functional universality. In Europe, this also exists, but strangely enough, it is sometimes seen as alternative or underground. It becomes a lifestyle choice. This has to do with its original links with the idea of the individual as the medium for the universal. So, for example, the originally UK-based but now expanded movement called Stuckism promotes what it calls figurative art in contrast to conceptual art. In the movement's manifesto, we read, quote, "It is the Stuckist's duty to explore his or her neurosis and innocence through the making of paintings and displaying them in the public, thereby enriching society by giving shared form to individual experience and individual form to shared experience." This is formalist romantic art, and I mentioned what that was in portrayed as the authentic mode of what art should function in. Anyway, in many other contexts, such as those of Egypt, Ethiopia, Azerbaijan, for example, and I stress here that I would say that this is true almost everywhere, and not just in so-called developing countries. Fine art is the dominant practice in terms of numbers and general perception of what art is. The aesthetics of these practices are asking the opposite question of Badiou's contemporary art. They are asking, how do we become formalist romantic? The problem is that this question has already been answered numerous times, so your answers can only be ghosts, shadows of art already produced in Europe in the past 5 centuries. So fine art is a ghost universalism, an international backyard of non-functional universalism that can link an art student from Alexandria to one in Philadelphia, for example. The second route this hypothetical student can follow is contemporary art condition A. The market status of contemporary art condition A is that it features in art fairs primarily, thematic exhibitions primarily with themes related to regions and geographies. Another option is to take the second route of becoming a contemporary artist who uncritically emphasizes the particularities of their perceived identity. The particularities of gender, religion, history, state politics, etc. Some artists, even well-known ones, start off working critically with these particularities, but end up being consumed by the particularities that they are trying to address. So that's condition A. Condition B, the market status of which is, it's featured in the discursive, critical wing of contemporary art and its institutions, critical biennials, publications, projects of a critical nature, and exhibitions. This third option is to practice as a contemporary artist who understands the mechanisms of the dominant ideology and its emphasis on particularisms. The plan becomes how to negotiate a methodology where you are dealing with particularistic material in a kind of semi-objective way, not assuming that it makes up your identity, but that somehow you remain outside of it. the archive, as we've seen in the example of Hassan Khan. This is a wide condition which features a range of voices and positions. Finally, the final route that is possible is the fine contemporary art, which I mentioned earlier. Usually, artists in this taking this route are commercially successful. Many have teaching positions. They feature in art fairs. Sometimes they make it into discursive art events, but rarely. This is half and half catalog and half archive. The artist thinks of history as an archive, but still needs to insert him or herself into the catalog. They want the best of both worlds. A fine contemporary artist can also be in flux, sometimes being more contemporary and on other occasions being more towards the fine arts. Now, I've been talking a lot about multiculturalism, so I'd like to end my talk with a little kind of section on multiculturalism. Sorry. And I'd like to talk about two projects where one project I curated myself, and another is something that's more looking into two versions of Documenta and how they deal with this dilemma of multiculturalism and universality. But first, for the project that I curated, which was part of Manifesta, it was a kind of sub-project inside Manifesta, and it was called the Mocha Sessions. Yeah. And basically, it started when I discovered this institution called the Friends of Puerto Rico, which was established in the mid-70s. And it was the mother organization that established and sought funding and logistics for an institution called the Cayman Gallery, which later changed its name. The Cayman Gallery changed its name to the Museum of Contemporary Hispanic Art, MOCHA. The logo for this organization was particularly interesting for me, because I think it kind of, for me, it was one of those, enlightened moments. You get kind of like, all of a sudden, everything makes sense, and this whole how this logo works, which I later kind of made into the logo of the actual project, for me represents what. Kind of like the multiculturalist system or logic of contemporary art is all about, basically. How this universality works, how this predominant paradoxical universality works. We have this lamp sitting on top, knowledge, the book here. And what's holding this lamp up is basically the system. And the system has three pillars: education, culture, and understanding. So for me, the idea was that I literally wanted to look at this whole construction, the necessity of it, the actual meaning of it, the value of it, this idea of knowledge production and contemporary art being based on these three pillars that are kind of really very hard to budge. And I mean, what I mean by these three pillars, I mean, if we just think about, for example, the mission statements of art institutions today, can we not boil most of them down to these three bare essentials? I was talking to Ola, my friend, yesterday, and I was telling her about how in institutions it's quite weird that like an institution has this mission statement, and most of them are very familiar and similar, and actually what they're doing doesn't necessarily gel with what they're saying, most of the time, because I think it's how this bureaucratical, ethical, aesthetic system that I was talking about earlier wants to predefine what you're doing, pre-package your universalism. And that these are certain things you have to comply, the certain protocols that you have to comply with as an institution and most of the time as an artist. But also my interest came from the idea that there's a lot of talk about multiculturalism, and you can understand multiculturalism on many different levels, but actually the term itself I think is many times misused or used as a kind of code for something else. So for example, in European politics, when they talk about, for example, when like the German Chancellor comes out on TV and she says, multiculturalism is dead, what she actually means is our relationship with North African and Turkish immigrants is dead. She doesn't really mean multiculturalism. This is something else, but she has to use that as a kind of polite form of saying that. Yeah. But in our art field, this multiculturalism, I think, means a culture composed of a plural set of predefined cultures. But there's a kind of all-consuming notion that has them, like I showed in that diagram in the beginning. But I think it's a whole kind of to see multiculturalism, the one we have today. I think we have to go back to its roots. The early 70s, the 80s. The Reagan and Thatcher administration periods, why they wanted to do this, and how it actually looked in the beginning, because it was completely different from the way it looked today. It's like today I think it's nuanced, it's advanced, it's been restructured, reformulated. It's very hard to see why anybody would want to kind of say this is a bad thing. Actually, it's mostly quite a good thing. The problem with it is that it's highly bureaucratical, from my point of view, and highly predetermined as a form of universality, thus limiting the chances for anything that's imagined otherwise. But if we look at the original blueprint for what this multiculturalist discourse is, and how in the beginning it was so raw and kind of underdeveloped, you could actually see the wiring of this thing in a way. So this is what this project tried to do. It went into the archives of this institution, which only lasted for 5 years, because ultimately when the Cayman Gallery renamed itself in the Reagan years as the Museum of Contemporary Hispanic Art, and received large endowments to kind of create this museum, in a way, it couldn't continue because it got, in a way, it got too big with its ideas in a way. So what this project is it's a representation of parts of the archive, some financial papers, things like letters from Ronald Reagan to the institution, praising them about the great multicultural work that they're doing, newspaper clippings, all sorts of things from the archive presented. And then we asked 6 artists each to respond, catalogs, you know, like you can see by, you know, the Cayman Gallery, which promotes contemporary Hispanic art, published publications titled Hispanic Perceptions or Latin American Primitives, and so on, which is quite unusual for me to see, but which also proves that, you know, these people were Hispanic also, that they were doing this, and it's the kind of the early prerequisites of the system, I think, were much more rigid than they are today. Today, with the advancement of critical ability, we can kind of, in many ways, subtract ourselves from the whole, you know, construct and the mechanism of the system, to an extent. So this is a brief description of the project. Is that for the MoCA sessions, I invited 6 artists residing in the town where Manifesta was happening that year, Murcia in the southeast of Spain, to delve into a certain niche of 1980s art history, the niche where multiculturalist discourse in art began to look as if it was never going to change, becoming an inseparable and integral part of the art industry. The project brought part of the archive of the short-lived Museum of Contemporary Hispanic Art, MOCHA, in New York, that lasted from 1985 to 1990, to Spain for the first time, and invited the artists to engage with the material. MOCHA emerged during the rise of institutional multiculturalism, showcasing the work of artists of Hispanic descent who were deemed otherwise underrepresented in the mainstream. The archive was a catalyst for speculating on the origins and future of many of the recognized parameters of contemporary art, from identity politics to institutional critique. Now, if we take this idea of multiculturalism and kind of shift it into better known and more talked about institutions, you know, events, you know, highly, like super events, like, for example, Documenta. We begin to see how also multiculturalism, I think multiculturalism, since I define it as being the functional universality and universality, are always somehow under the surface the most important factors of how a documenta or a big biennial documenta is kind of critiqued and sometimes, you know, destroyed critically or acclaimed critically. But actually that the word multiculturalism or the word universality is never mentioned, despite my belief that actually they are the main problems or the main concerns that turn one version into a success story, another version into a disaster for critics. And so if I take a look at the 2 versions, which are actually the last 2 versions, Documenta 11, which was curated by Okwi Anuzo, and Documenta 12, which was in 2007, if I remember correctly, curated by Roger Bruegel and Ruth Nowak. If we look at research, like analytical research, despite their much celebrated and elaborated differences, Documenta 11, 2002, and Documenta 12, 2007, exhibited works by exactly the same percentage of Western artists and exactly the same percentage of non-Western artists. According to a study by Chin Tao Wu, which was called Biennials Without Borders. he analyzed the exact numbers of artists and their nationalities. Thus, I mean, and the whole argument that usually documented 12 in 2007 is perceived as, you know, like not multicultural enough in a way. If you read just flick through, you know, a Google search and read the essays written about it, it's usually perceived as this kind of like lapse into non-multiculturalism or Eurocentrism, basically. But actually, statistics prove that this is not actually the case. So what is the problem? Thus, if a third universality is to emerge after the old universalism and the more recent multiculturalism, it should develop beyond the realms of statistics. Hospitality, inclusion, arguments about la différence and sameness, victimizations, and humanization. However, the curatorial project or artwork attempting to reach this third universality must also maintain some degree of particularity. For after multiculturalism, there is no way of reverting back to the sometimes almost complete absence of reference to contingent particularities found in much modernist art. And perhaps this is a good thing. This demanding balance is important for a project that wishes to revitalize the construction of meaning on the same intricate levels of complexity in world and human relations shaped by history, class, race, gender, and politics. In light of this, curators and critics might benefit from undertaking serious attempts to explore and analyze such complex issues as the reasons behind the schism between contemporary and fine art, instead of merely using fine art in an Adornian sense of bad art to define the borders of the contemporary. Documenta 11 seemed to accept the term of multiculturalism's universality in order to perhaps stretch the audience's imagination of both its limitations and possibilities. Edition 11 was a pragmatic undertaking that attempted to gain ground within the prefabricated universality that allowed its existence. It was perhaps fueled by hopes and possibilities that seem to be vanishing into thin air today. Documenta 12, on the other hand, seemed to want to resist the universality of multiculturalism. But resistance alone does not amount to a solution, of course, especially when the methodology suggests an attempted resurrection of the universality of the canon that has the individual at its core. The incompatibility of this old universality that could be read between the curatorial lines with the multicultural universality found in the majority of today's art made it seem as if the curators themselves as if the curators themselves were the source of this universality. It also estranged the exhibited art from its curatorial framing. The result, as most of us are aware, was a mass critical deconstruction of edition 12. So perhaps the edition 12 had a more advanced position in some ways. But the problem was it didn't present any solutions. And I think this is where today curators, I think, can intervene in the kind of string of events. Curatorial imagination, needs to look at a kind of third universality instead of using either or having, you know, romantic affiliations with previous universalities as a kind of you know, what do you call it, tactic against multiculturalist or pragmatic universality. You know, like a few years ago, there was this kind of these exhibitions that suddenly pop up, or that were all dealing with, you know, like beauty. And you know, there were just the titles. Some of these titles like beauty, you know, aesthetics and beauty, and I think that was kind of one of these moments where people were like, "Look, we don't want this multiculturalist crap. We want something that is really more related to this old kind of universality." And there is something promising in that old universality, but it's just that it was kind of sabotaged by colonialism in a way. And so I think the mission of the curator, or one of the missions of a curator, should be to look at the possibility for developing a universality that, or kind of imagining the parameters of a universality that is not that, this multiculturalist, pragmatic, paradoxical universality of today, but is also not that old school universality. The third universality, the universality to come, must be a thoughtful synthesis that takes into consideration how its predecessors functioned. What contexts they functioned in, and to what ends. One of the upcoming challenges for curating and criticism is to experiment with ideas and methodologies that pave the way for the introduction of new prototypes for universality, while still functioning under the reign of multiculturalist universality. Universality has somehow been off-centered from curatorial debates. It exists as that which is present and yet not visible, visible and yet not present. With political conditions looking as grim and tense as they look today, perhaps it's time for universality to take center stage. Thank you very much. Yes, sure.
I feel somehow that you're presenting notions that are not, I'm just trying to think about everything you're saying and the relations you do, and I don't think when you talk about multiculturalism, you're talking about this notion. I would wonder why you don't, if you're distorting all these notions into something else, why wouldn't you come with other names? Because I have a problem with this, all these namings, because they come from a very hegemonic center. The universalism comes from Europe, enlightened Europe, and I don't know, I come from Brazil, or South America, or Latin America, and it's very hard for any art historian or intellectual to simply accept these terms. And multiculturalism as well, it's not something that, it was never understood as something that was useful for anything. So I think it was created for a very specific, it was created in US, as far as I know, because in the 80s, this plural identities was important here and was an issue here, while for us, it was never an issue. It's not about plural, it's about what to do with this hybrid thing that we have there. So we never, like the theoreticians and art historians from Latin America would never accept this notion of multiculturalism. And so I wonder, why do you, if you were like making this whole new theory, why do you have to keep with that?
Because that's what it's called. You know, that's not. I mean, I don't know. Have you? Do you have? I would say like pivotal art history books that are published in Brazil? I don't think so. So, and that's what it's called, you know. So I think this is the problem, you know, like not just art history, you know, I'm not using them because I accept them. I'm using them because I'm trying to think about the possibility of something else. You know, that's the well, you know, it's like, but I have to kind of accept that they're there and that they're in use and that we comply to at least certain parts of them. And so I mean, I think it's not in the idea that I actually like the terminology, but I'm just using them for practical reasons. And yeah, I mean, multiculturalism, wherever it started, you know, I think it was a development that you know, that happened in America and in the UK at the same time. But beyond that, it was later the whole idea of like cultural exchange and artists traveling to different countries and cultural engagement and how, you know, like arts councils would support artists' travels, and it's all linked to the you know, the event economy, you know, like and the event economy, you know, art in the event economy, and that's linked to tourism, and that's linked to capitalism. So it's a whole chain, you know. It's nothing that I can, you know, little tiny me, all of a sudden, you know, like, like I don't want to use multiculturalism. Well, it's there, you know. There's nothing, I can't do anything about it, and I'm just using it to try and imagine something else. You know, this is the point. Somebody, sorry, I can't see very well. The light's glaring in my eyes.
I appreciate your talk. I do think that one of the missing, or kind of the absent discussions here concerns the fact that the visual project, a post-colonial identity, was in some ways largely a failure, but an interesting failure, and actually a lot of the most, you know, discursive and subversive and really groundbreaking practices happened in the form of the novel and in literary work that was looking at post-colonial identity and trying to find a new form of language which would actually show the breaks in ideology or to show the illusions of the West. And I think what I was interested in, you talked about something in relationship to like derivatives, like as if, you know, people are, you know, contemporary artists working in Egypt, you know, either they can choose this derivative action, or they can choose a hybrid of the derivatives, or they can finally find some way to exist somehow uncomfortably with these derivative kind of works. And I think that was interesting to me because in literature there are a number of countries where people would think that there was no way to write a novel without being derivative of the Western idea of literature, but at the same time, think of someone like Toni Morrison or Salman Rushdie, which completely blew that out of the water and actually completely constructed a new genre and no longer even talked about being derivative, which actually in its own way re-reifies margin and center in a way that is totally against the project that you describe. And I think that that's interesting that there was a tension in your talk where you kind of were reifying Documenta as like a center, and then not really giving us the specificity of some of the more, you know, kind of kitchen table or neighborhood, you know, based movements that might have been going on in Egypt, for instance. I think it's just interesting to think of that, how that notion of the derivative might actually still kind of create these
well, I wasn't really talking about derivatives in that sense, the sense that you mentioned. I think you're talking about the idea of what I'm actually trying to say is that I think I go into this in two sections in the talk. One is where I'm actually trying to say that this old school European universalism is actually, it's, I mean, why did, if it was so bad, you know, why did, for example, artists not resist it? You know, why do artists in Egypt and in Africa and in other countries, why do they paint, you know, like oil paintings that are sometimes figurative and sometimes, whatever, and of course, I didn't show any good fine art here, but I mean there is fine art that when fine art was good, it was good when its universality was accepted as the norm. And this is the whole point of the talk, I think. It's the idea of who has the power to say that this universality is okay, it's acceptable, back in modernist times, it wasn't a bureaucratical affair. Colonialism was going on, but it wasn't a bureaucratical affair. I mean, like the way, for example, Egypt established its first fine art academy in 1920, was that basically Egypt at that time was under British colonialism, but it was also a country where a lot of Italians and French traders had their businesses. And with this, there was a kind of aristocratic tendency to invite teachers to teach painting and sculpture. And the Egyptian aristocracy, they wanted to also be part of this, and so they created the first fine art school in Cairo in 1920. And the professors there were, well, the painters, they weren't professors, the painters and teachers that were teaching there, they were mostly French and Italian. But then later on, a little later on, at the end of the 20s, the government started supporting the first Egyptian, visual artists in the sense that we know, like visual art like we know today. They started supporting and sending them to study in Italy and France, particularly. And then you have the first wave of Egyptian artists coming in the late 20s back from France and producing the so-called first Egyptian art. Yeah, what I'm saying is that, I mean, these guys were, Egyptian. They didn't say at that point that, oh, this is horrible, like this is being imposed on us by the French or by the Italians, They adopted this because it wasn't a matter of bureaucracy. What I'm trying to say is that under the current system, the story is quite different. Yes, I mean, I totally agree with you about your point of mentioning Toni Morrison and Salman Rushdie. They're great writers, and I think literature is something else. It's a different domain, and I don't think there's... what I'm talking about is the art economy and how it functions, and specifically the visual arts and fine arts economies. So I don't think the comparison really gels very well, but irrespective, I mean, it's not to say that what these people are doing is Eurocentric, or it has to comply, or it has to be derivative. Not at all. What I'm just trying to say is that under the current economy of art, which predictates your universality. I mean, as for example, an artist from Africa, if you're making a certain type of work, I mean, if you really want to just, like stay in your studio and paint, like landscapes, for example. And I witnessed this with my own very eyes, like I was invited once by the ICA, the International Association of Art Critics, for a conference in Addis Ababa. And we went to visit the Academy of Fine Arts in Addis Ababa, and some of the critics, and they were French and European critics, most of them. They started kind of talking quite aggressively to the students, because the students were making. They called it European art. They were painting landscapes, you know what I mean? And for them, they don't want to see that. They want to see something that's not, you know, European art. As if, you know, you could walk into the academy Addis Ababa and suddenly there'll be some tribal dance happening or something. So I think this is the problematic, you know, like the expectations, but also how these expectations are embedded. It's not like, you know, you have to represent your Africanness in art, but at the same time, there must be a certain degree of applying to the protocol. It is a multiculturalist universality in place, and it's in place through a bureaucracy. If you're an artist in Addis Ababa and you want to be successful internationally, you're not going to get there by painting landscapes. You know what I mean? And it's not just about Addis Ababa, about, you know, most parts of the world. There is a certain blend, you know, of particularisms, a blend of rootedness in the local situation, with other kind of protocols about a certain degree of conceptualism, a certain contextualization, and so on, that has to be present. I mean, it's this is the nature of the system. Otherwise, it's not going to be celebrated as something that's valid on the international circuit. So what I'm trying to say is I'm not trying to take away anything from anybody, you know, but I'm just trying to explain how this thing works and the limitations of it. You know what I mean? So I hope I've kind of made myself clear about that.
The reason why I brought up the literature is because it was considered in post-colonial practice a way to actually take on a shared imaginary, whether it was a visual imaginary, a textual imaginary, and that's why Ukwe and Wezer's, the whole magazine was called Third Text. In order to actually deal with the fact that it actually is, whether it's happening in literature or in visual arts, it's actually a shared imaginary that people need to.
But I think the visual arts are much more susceptible. The visual and performing arts are much more susceptible to the constraints of the current economy, the current hegemonic economy in the world, than is literature. Because literature, at the end of the day, it can be something that's very hermetic in a way. You can just lock yourself in a room and write, and then it depends on your relationship with the publisher if it gets published or not. But in visual arts, I think it's a much more the economy doesn't work that way. You know, that person who's in the studio just painting away without kind of realizing the dynamics of what's expected of him within the larger scenario might not be so successful. Thank you very much.